Hello, and welcome to part 10 of the Unsolved Mystery Mega Iceberg Explained. I know we're all super excited about Lana Del Rey's new album, but tonight I'm going to ask you to put it on pause because we are ready to dive into layer 4 of this iceberg. What does it do? That's the beauty of it. It doesn't do anything. That is the famous quote almost everybody has heard, yet nobody knows where it comes from. It's kind of like a reverse Mandela effect. The scene is from a movie or TV show or something that is often quoted. The first person asks, "What does it do?" And the second person replies, "That's the beauty of it. It doesn't do anything." Upon first hearing it, people will make the typical guesses. Back to the Future, The Big Lebowski, Office Space, etc. And yet, these are all wrong. Some people even take the other view that this quote doesn't come from any famous scene. Yet, that's most likely wrong too. It's currently one of the biggest cultural mysteries out there. So far, online sleuths have narrowed it down to two possible sources. One is from a TV show in the 60s called Burke's Law. In an episode called Who Killed 711, a detective questions a murder suspect and notes that the man is building a curious machine. And when the detective asks him what it's for, he says, quote, "Well, nothing. Nothing. I mean, that's the beauty of it. Every machine in the world does something, but not mine," end quote. Which is pretty close, but it's not the exact quote. A second possible source comes from a play called Apocalyptic Butterflies, which is about a relationship between a couple named Hank and Mariel Tater. In the play, Hank's father Dick, who is an eccentric character, shows up to Hank's house with a truckload of painted wooden butterflies. When Hank, who is obviously confused, asks what it is, his father replies that it's a butterfly. Hank continues, "What does it do?" His father then says, quote, "Doesn't do anything. That's the beauty of it," end quote. Which is the correct wording, but flipped around from the mystery quote online sleuths are looking for. But this misses the larger point. Just how many people have seen this play, or this TV show? Not enough for this quote to be so popular. As an aside, when I first read the quote, I kept seeing a car commercial in my head, and I feel like for sure I heard it there. And that's not uncommon, because to the other people that discuss this, they remember hearing the quote distinctively, yet they just don't remember from where. 12 Heidelberg fires. In 1986, artist Tyree Guyton of Detroit, Michigan, started an art project in the eastern part of town called the Heidelberg Project, in which he would basically take ran-down abandoned homes and started affixing objects to them, such as dolls and toys, and in one case records, while also painting various designs. And outside of October of 1991, when the mayor of Detroit ordered 3 of the homes and art bulldozed, the displays have been largely left alone. In fact, it became something of a tourist attraction, and it has been featured on several TV shows. So it's strange that on May 2nd, 2013, one of the homes would erupt into flames in the early morning hours. By the time firefighters arrived, the 2-story home was an inferno, fed by hundreds of paintings that covered the house. Not to be deterred, Tyree decided to try and create a new project from what remained of the burnt home. But by that October, it would be set ablaze again. It wasn't long after this that 4 more of the structures were burned down, while another sustained major smoke damage, and one home that Tyree had fashioned up for a friend was also set ablaze. The arson investigators could find no suspects or motive, but they almost caught a break when security cameras would actually capture a man whose face was cloaked by a hoodie, carrying a white plastic jug, and went behind the home off of the camera view. And then moments later, the home erupted into flames. It had actually lit so fast that it appeared the upper half of the man's body had caught fire as he ran away. Arson investigators would contact local hospitals, looking for anyone who may have been treated for burns, but they found no one. The mystery was so difficult to crack that the ATF actually came in to help. And despite the reward, press, and security cameras, authorities were no closer to nabbing the man behind the fires, which now numbered 12. 2003 Ricin Letters. On October 15th, 2003, a package would arrive to the Mail Sort Center in Greenville, South Carolina. This package came with an odd label, one that read, quote, "Caution, ricin poison enclosed in a sealed container. Do not open without proper protection," end quote. The package would be tested, and sure enough, it did contain ricin, which is a white powder that in small quantities can be fatal. Once investigators opened the envelope, they found a letter which was typewritten. It read, quote, "To the Department of Transportation, I'm a fleet owner of a tanker company. I have access to castor pulp. If my demand is dismissed, I'm capable of making ricin. My demand is simple. January 4th, 2004 starts the new hours of service for trucks which include a ridiculous 10 hours in the sleeper berth. Keep it 8 or I will start dumping. You have been warned. This is the only letter that will be sent by me. Signed, Fallen Angel." End quote. Thankfully, no one was hurt or killed. But what was he referring to? Apparently, on January 4th of 2004, new transportation rules were going into effect for the long-haul trucking industry in an attempt to reduce fatigue-related accidents and fatalities. It was the most far-reaching rule change in close to 70 years, reducing daily allowed driving time from 11 to 10 hours. But the most controversial part was that the truckers were no longer allowed to factor in delays, such as food and fuel stops, or even time spent waiting for a truck to be loaded up with goods. And in addition to the 10 hours of driving, truckers were only allowed to be on duty for a total of 14 hours, which that could be used up in a hurry when you count all of the stops plus the loading times. Safe to say, a lot of truckers were mad, but this guy was really mad. About 3 weeks after the first letter, another one would pop up. This time it was addressed to the White House, where it was caught by a mail processing facility. It too contained ricin, and it was postmarked in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And although it was addressed to the White House, its threatening language was aimed at the Department of Transportation. The letter read, quote, "Department of Transportation, if you change the hours of service on January 4th, 2004, I will turn DC into a ghost town. The powder on the letter is ricin. Have a nice day. Signed, Fallen Angel." End quote. Finally, on February 2nd, 2004, a mailroom serving Senator Bill Frist would also find ricin. This led to more than a dozen staffers undergoing decontamination, as well as closure of 3 Senate office buildings. An investigation into the mysterious fallen angel would begin. Agents questioned several individuals, particularly one vocal former truck driver from Florida. Strangely enough, investigators would determine that the ricin found in the Senate office building was not connected to that of the fallen angel, and by 2005, investigators confirmed they never found a suspect for either attempt. And finally, by 2008, they confirmed once again that the two cases were separate, and in spite of a $100,000 reward, neither suspect was ever captured. Agogwe. The Agogwe is an alleged cryptid that was first reported in East Africa. It's supposed to be a 4 to 5 feet tall, smallish man with brown or rusty colored hair all over its body. It has long arms and yellowish red skin under its coat, sometimes described as copper. Its feet are said to be about 5 inches long. It differs from that of a chimpanzee in that it has a rounded forehead and smaller but sharper teeth. The first report comes from Captain William Hitchens in December of 1937 in an edition of the journal Discovery, when quoting an expedition he had went on in 1900, 37 years prior. Quote, "Some years ago, I was sent on an official lion hunt in this area, and while waiting in a forest glade for a man-eater, I saw 2 small brown furry creatures come from the dense forest on one side of the glade and disappear into the thickets on the other. They were like little men, about 4 feet high, walking upright, but clad in russet hair. The native hunter with me gazed in mingled fear and amazement. They were," he said, "Agogwe, the little furry men whom one does not see once in a lifetime." End quote. The following year, a wine merchant would write a similar letter to the journal, yet he would claim the events happened in 1927. He stated, quote, "We were sufficiently near to land to see objects clearly with a glass of 12 magnifications. There was a sloping beach with light bush upon which several dozen baboons were hunting for and picking up shellfish or crabs to judge by their movements. 2 pure white baboons were amongst them. These are very rare, but I had heard of them previously. As we watched, 2 little brown men walked together out of the bush and down amongst the baboons. They were certainly not any known monkey, and yet they must have been akin, or they would have disturbed the baboons. They were too far away to be seen in great detail, but these small human-like animals were probably between 4 and 5 feet tall, quite upright and graceful in figure." End quote. But you have to wonder, in both of these cases, why they waited so long to tell anyone. By the late 50s, professional animal collector Charles Cordier would also report seeing it in Zaire, as it had become entangled in one of the bird snares he had set, but escaped before he could get to it. Quote, "It fell on its face, turned over, sat up, took the noose off its feet, and walked away before the nearby African could do anything." End quote. Some think that it could indicate the possible survival of gibbons in Africa, which are small tailless apes with rounded foreheads and small canines, while some speculate that it's a rare type of monkey. Others propose it could be a surviving species of Australopithecine, a bipedal primate that lived around 2.5 million years ago. Alonzo Brooks. On April 3, 2004, Alonzo Brooks would travel with 3 friends to a party in Lasinia, Kansas, about 50 miles south of Gardner, where the 23-year-old worked as a custodian. Alonzo was of African American and Mexican descent, and it's alleged that at this party, there were some racial slurs uttered towards Brooks, possibly causing tension between him and some other people there, while some witnesses state that this was possibly due to the fact that Brooks was flirting with a white woman, and others state that some drunken white men just wanted to fight him. Regardless, he was challenged to a fight, and according to investigations later, there were fights at this party, which consisted of 100 16 to 25-year-olds, and due to a misunderstanding between Brooks and his friends, all 3 would end up leaving the party without him, with each one thinking the other one was going to give him a ride home. This little mistake would come back to haunt them, because the next day, Brooks had still not returned home, and his family would go to Lasinia to search for him. After not being able to find him, they would go to the local authorities. The Lynn County Sheriff's Department would be called, and they found Alonzo's boots and hat pretty quickly in the weeds across the street from the farmhouse where the party had been. They would then search by air and land and found nothing else. After 2 days, they would turn the case over to the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. The FBI would eventually come in as well, and yet Brooks was still not found. But a month later, on May 1st, the family would be given permission to search the party house property for their son, citing that law enforcement was not telling them anything. So they just went over to the property owner and asked to search. And depending on which source you read, it only took half an hour or an hour and a half to find him. He was tangled in a brush pile on a creek bed. His body was well preserved and did not look like it set out in the elements for over a month, but the autopsy was strange in the fact that it didn't find any sign of blunt force trauma, or any injury really, and he also had not drowned. The autopsy, done by Dr. Eric Mitchell, would state that the cause of death could not be determined, but Mitchell, well, he had relocated to Kansas after being investigated for misconduct as chief medical examiner in upstate New York, which included harvesting organs and improperly storing skeletons in his office. He was not charged, but he was asked to resign, meaning his conclusion in this was heavily questioned. But in 2019, Netflix's Unsolved Mysteries would bring attention back to the case, and just a year later, in June 2020, the FBI would reopen it and offered a $100,000 reward for information leading to Brooks's death. And a month later, they would exhume the body and transport it to Dover Air Force Base for another autopsy. This time, the Armed Forces medical examiner was able to determine that Brooks's death was due to homicide. The acting U.S. attorney would comment that the FBI had known since the early investigation that the death had suspicious circumstances, but it wasn't until this autopsy that they had proof. He also stated he believed multiple people knew what happened that night and called on someone to come forward. The autopsy said there were injuries that were not consistent with decomposition, and as far as theories go, well, there's many. One is that Alonzo's friends set him up to be killed by drug dealers, and citing the hat and boot found next to the highway, some think Alonzo was drunk and hitchhiking, only to be picked up by someone who killed him. Others say he was chased down the driveway and attacked by some of the partygoers. There's also the part about the body being well preserved. It's led to speculation that the body was stored in a large freezer, which means someone probably helped. I did find one interesting link that I'll leave in the description below that gives a huge detailing of the goings-on in this case, if you are interested. Alps Murders. On September 5th, 2012, at 3:45 p.m., a former British RAF pilot, Brett Martin, who now lived in France, was out riding his bicycle near the French Alps. After crossing a bridge that spanned over a river, he would continue to ride for a few hundred meters, when he crossed the horrifying scene. In his field of vision was a young girl stumbling into the road and collapsing right in front of his track. Brett at first thought she might be playing until he got closer. The 7-year-old, Zainab Al-Hili, had been shot in the shoulder and beaten with a gun. He then began to look at the entire scene and could tell that the vehicle had been reversed sharply into the rest area. The car's engine was still running and the gear was still in reverse, with the rear wheels spinning about in the sand. In front of the car lay a French cyclist, Sylvain Maillet, who had been shot 7 times. And in the car, Brett seen 3 people, all dead. That being an Iraqi-born British tourist named Saad Al-Hili, 50 years old, his wife, Iqbal, 47, and her mother, Sahala Al-Alaf, 74. Investigators arrived to the scene and counted 25 shots, or, by some sources, 21, that had been fired. The weapon of choice was a semi-automatic pistol Luger P06 with an 8-round magazine. The young girl, Zainab, who had collapsed in front of the vehicle, was rushed to the hospital and miraculously survived. But maybe the craziest part was after the police closed the scene off and started their investigation, they would interview a neighbor at the campground where the family had been staying. This neighbor would tell them about the other little girl who had not been found yet. When police went back to check, they found 4-year-old Zena hidden under the legs of her dead mother in the rear footwell. She had hidden that spot for 8 hours. That's sad, but at least she survived. France and Britain agreed to create a joint investigation team. One of the early suspects was Saad's own brother, Zaid. He would be taken in the following year in connection with the murder, with the motive alleged to have been a family squabble over money. He would eventually be released, however, as there was no real evidence. Another clue that came out early in the investigation was that of a gray BMW X5, which was at the crime scene at the time, and it's thought that the driver might have been an accomplice. And then there's also the report of a motorcycle rider with a weird helmet that was also there and thought to be an accomplice. He was eventually tracked down and ruled out, but then detained again and questioned and released. Detectives assumed at first that Sylvain Maillet was the real target, since he was shot 7 times. However, a counter theory was proposed, that it's possible that Sylvain could have been the first to see what the gunman was up to and rushed the shooter, hence the suspect being enraged and shot him more times. It's also here that investigators figured out that Saad had made a break for it, back to the vehicle, while the suspect was shooting Maillet. He would then be shot in the back, but he did make it to the car. In his panic, he reversed too far and got stuck on the soft sandy ground, which allowed the suspect to walk over and kill all of the trapped victims. This brings me back to the 2 daughters. It is not known if he simply ran out of ammo and chose to beat Zainab while leaving Zena, or if he simply chose to spare both of them. There are a ton of theories on this case, and I'm not going to list all of them due to time constraints. I'm just going to go with the one favored by investigators now, and that is the lone psychopath theory. And although that is very rare, and people don't want to accept it because it doesn't make sense without a motive, there's one big clue that points toward this being the reality, and that is, neither Sylvain Maillet nor the Al-Hili family had planned to be in that location that day. Also, investigators can pretty much rule out that either one of them were followed. The Al-Hili family ended up being there only after taking a wrong turn, whereas Maillet told his girlfriend last minute he was changing up his intended route, which is why he ended up there. Anthonette Cayedito. On April 5th, 1986, Penny Cayedito of Gallup, New Mexico, would meet up with some friends and go out to a local bar. Before going, she would get a babysitter for her daughters, 9-year-old Anthonette, 7-year-old Sadie, and 5-year-old Wendy. Penny would then spend the evening with her friends and came back around midnight and dismissed the babysitter. Penny would then go to bed herself. The next morning at 7 a.m., Penny would wake up in order to prepare the girls for Bible school, but when she got to Anthonette's room, she did not see her. She would search the home before checking throughout the neighborhood until 11 a.m., but she could not find Anthonette. So Penny returned home and called the police. The police would tell Penny she had to wait 8 hours before making a missing persons report. A search for her later would begin, yet yielded no results. An investigation then would ensue, and detectives learned from Anthonette's 5-year-old sister Wendy that someone had came to the door that night at 3 a.m. identifying themselves as Uncle Joe. Anthonette would get up to answer the door, and Wendy allegedly went back to sleep, and that was the last time she seen her. Neighbors would also report that an older model brown truck was outside the home between 6:30 and 7 a.m., around the time that Penny awoke. The neighbor then said the man walked toward the home, yet the neighbor could not see him or the vehicle good enough to get a great description. The case would go cold, but a year later, the Gallup Police Department received a frantic phone call from a young girl who claimed to be Anthonette. She would state that she was in Albuquerque, which is a little over 2 hours east of Gallup. Before she could reveal her exact location, an adult was heard shouting, quote, "Who said you could use the phone?" end quote, followed by Anthonette screaming, then sounds of a scuffle and the phone call being cut off. The entire thing lasted about 40 seconds. Penny would get to listen to the call and stated that it was her belief that it was Anthonette. 4 years passed by, and in 1991, a waitress working in Carson City, Nevada, about 13 and a half hours away from Gallup, would encounter a teenager who matched Anthonette's description, and she was in the company of a scruffy-looking couple. The teenager kept knocking her utensils in the floor, and when the waitress handed them back to her, she noted that the girl grabbed her hand and squeezed firmly, as if it was some attempt to get her attention. After they left, the waitress cleaned their table and found a napkin under the plate, which contained the messages that read, "Help me," and "Call the police," written on it. Also happening around this time was Wendy, the 5-year-old sister, who was now 10, would give a more detailed account of what had happened that night. She claimed both her and Anthonette heard a knock at 3 a.m., and that person identified himself as Uncle Joe. When Anthonette opened the door, she was grabbed by 2 men, and she started to kick and scream. They covered her mouth and then took her to a brown van that Wendy said she did not recognize. As far as the theories go, the 2 most plausible ones is that she was a victim of homicide or human trafficking. And as far as suspects go, there are none. Well, at least none that were publicly named. Although, investigators have long assumed that the mother, Penny, knows more than she ever said, and there's good reason for this. First off, she took a lie detector test, and the results were inconclusive or failed, depending on which source you read. And we know lie detector tests can't be taken seriously. But there are other reasons. For one, both siblings would state later as adults that Anthonette was more like a mother to them, as she was basically taking care of them. But perhaps the most damning is the fact that Penny made several expensive purchases after Anthonette was abducted, leaving investigators to theorize that the abductors and Penny were paid by the couple in Nevada for Anthonette. However, others disagree and believe Penny was not involved. Besides, she may have been trying to cover up for the fact that she was dealing in drugs, which gave off the appearance that she was trying to cover up for what happened to Anthonette. Area 51 caller. If, like me, you are a fan of Coast to Coast AM, then you know where this next one is going. Coast to Coast AM is a late-night radio talk show that deals with a variety of topics, with a heavy leaning towards the paranormal and conspiracy theories. The show airs between 1 and 5 a.m., and it's always been the dominant show in that time slot. But I mean, what other competition is on during those hours? However, the show is not the same as it once was. The program actually came into its prominence in the mid-90s, but it was created in 1988 by a man named Art Bell. Art was a legendary radio host, and the show averaged about 15 million listeners a night in the 90s, which is insane. But this was in the day before podcast, and no other show was really doing what Art was, so if you was into the paranormal, you stayed up and listened. Art hosted the show until 2000, and retired and came back a number of times. Eventually though, he sold the show and it still airs to this day, and he would pass away in 2018. If you ask people that listened to it back then what they remember the most about it, some will bring up the guest, who varied between legit scientists to some of the most wacky crackpots out there, or some might even bring up Art's hosting style and how you could get lost in his stories. But the thing most people will bring up is the callers, because in addition to letting callers phone in to talk to the guest, Art had a night called Open Lines, where you could call in and talk about anything. And what made Art unique was he refused to have a call screener, so he had no idea what the call was going to be. And believe me, this show attracted some crazies that would call in. But there were also some that have gone down as classics, such as the guy who called from a small airplane and claimed that he was about to fly over Area 51. only to tell Art they were aiming something at him and then the phone cut out. Another classic was when a guy named Mel called in and claimed he found a hole in the woods where he was lowering miles of fishing line down into it and still hadn't touched the ground. But the most well remembered, and the one this mystery is about, is the so-called Area 51 caller. On September 11th, 1997, Bell would take a call from a frantic man that claimed to be an ex-Area 51 employee. As the call went on, he got more and more upset, almost crying at certain points. He would claim he didn't have long to tell Art everything, because they would triangulate on his position soon. He would then go on about aliens being extra-dimensional beings, who were planning on destroying humanity, etc., etc. But what makes this call memorable is that while all this is going on, the show's feed starts to cut out, and then all of a sudden, the entire show goes off the air. The show would go dead for about 5 seconds, and then Art came back on and explained that the show's uplink transmitter had went dead for the first time in his career. On that particular call, fans would immediately jump to the conclusion that the government had took the show off the air, meaning that the caller must have been legit. As far as theories go, well, it could have just been a prank. If so, the guy's acting was tremendous. Second theory is, well, maybe Art set it up, but in his defense, he wasn't known to do that, and there's no other known examples of him setting up a skit like that. The final theory is, well, it was real, but I'm going to play a clip and let you decide.
To now, Art.
But they're not doing anything.
They are not. They want the major population centers wiped out so that the few that are left will be more easily controllable.
Discharged.
I started getting...
Well, this was certainly interesting. We are now on a backup system, everybody. A backup system. And that one caller that I had on the air, I guess we were about in the middle of his transmission, his telephone call, which was one of the strangest ones I've ever had. And the entire transmitting system by satellite went down here, and we were notified we were off the air. And it would appear to be from this end and some sort of massive transmit failure. So we are now using a backup system to be on the air. And not that I would normally believe this kind of thing, mind you, but I can't help but wonder if somebody zapped us in some way. We'll find out.
Atmospheric jellyfish. The atmospheric jellyfish is an alleged cryptid, although sometimes classified as UFO, seen floating throughout the atmosphere. There's been hundreds of sightings observed all over the globe, and what makes these sightings particularly noteworthy is that it has been seen by some of the top meteorological scientists in the world, so there's no dispute that they exist. It's more a question of what they really are. The first confirmed sighting came on September 20th, 1977, over Lake Onega in Russia. It was sighted by hundreds of the locals in the area around 4:15 a.m. and was a star-like light that came nearer and descended in a spiral trajectory and then looked like a ball of fire. It reduced its speed and hovered in the same spot for 6 minutes. It then supposedly made a terrible sound like that of a siren. It would then go silent and move towards the town. Then, hundreds of rays of lights would hit the earth, and whatever this was, now looked like a big jellyfish with golden tentacles and shining with beautiful colors. It would finally make its way to the harbor, where it got so bright that people could not even look at it, before turning into an elliptical ring and floating up through the clouds and disappearing. The whole thing lasted about 12 minutes. Another one of the more famous sightings happened just a few years ago, on June 1st, 2015, as Harry Purton of the Netherlands had went out to take photos of a storm. As he was taking the photos, he would capture a flash of light he thought was lightning, until he got home and observed the photo, as you can see here. Another recent one came on January 20th, 2010, by photographer Per Aron Mikkelsen over Andines, Norway. He was fascinated with the northern lights, which he was able to see that night, and as he was taking a picture of them, He would capture a picture of a jellyfish. At first, he thought it was a spot on his camera lens, but after he posted the picture online, one scientist would state that it was not the camera's fault, and he claimed that the jellyfish was where the northern lights were bouncing off an external source like a satellite, causing an iridium flare, which appear as bright white flashes in the sky. And this is pretty much the same conclusion that NASA has reached, claiming that these so-called cryptids are nothing more than space debris reflecting off the northern lights, or possibly even weather balloons or clouds. But one problem with this theory is that the light intensity from the northern lights is 100,000 times weaker than the sunlight, and there's also the fact that the jellyfish are green and not white, like the reflection from a satellite should be. Badajoz UFO Incident. And now we go from one cryptid/UFO story to the next. On November 12, 1965, at 1:45 a.m., soldiers Jose Trejo and Juan Lujan were patrolling a fuel storage area at Base Area de Talavera La Real in Badajoz, Spain. The two were about 200 feet apart when they would hear a noise that is similar to radio interference. Trejo would ask Lujan if he had heard the noise too, and he confirmed he did. The noise would then turn to that of a whistle, which the men said it made them feel like their skulls were about to burst. Jose asked Juan to follow him for an inspection of the area, as they feared an act of sabotage had been committed. The whistling sound ceased after about 5 minutes, and soon after, they would spot an intensely bright vertical light in the sky. That would last about 15 seconds, and about that time another guard with a dog arrived. After contacting a senior officer, they were directed to do a sweep of the area to look for saboteurs. After they cleared an area of around 1,000 feet, they would feel a swirl of wind and hear the sound of twigs being broken nearby. The dog was released, and he went towards the sound. They expected to hear a bark, but the dog instead returned a few seconds later, wobbling and appearing ill. Eventually, the dog would come back to its senses and began to circle the three soldiers, which is a defensive technique taught to guard dogs, meant to protect their handlers. Trejo would then spot a human-shaped green light to his left, about 10 feet tall. It was formed of small light points, with more brightness along the edges. The head was small and covered by what looked like a helmet, and the arms were very long and were crossed. He could see no hands or feet though. Trejo would faint, and the other two soldiers opened fire on the creature. The two men fired between 40 to 50 shots. They claimed that as it was being hit, the brightness became more intense and disappeared. They would then check on Trejo, and the sound returned for about 10 to 15 seconds. The next morning, around 50 men would be dispatched to search the area. They did not find any bullet casings, nor any bullet holes. However, the Air Force did conclude that the machine guns had been fired. A few days later, Trejo would actually go blind and unconscious in the base's dining room. He would begin to experience other health issues too, and he ended up being hospitalized on November 30th. Just 2.5 weeks later, he was diagnosed with, quote, nervous imbalance, end quote. He would recover though, and it never happened again. To this day, no one knows what the men seen. Banksey. Banksey is the name of a popular England-based street artist whose real name has remained hidden for years and is subject to lots of speculation. He started in 1990, and his art is pretty distinctive. A lot of it's based on political social commentary, and it's appeared on numerous streets, walls, and bridges throughout the world. It grew out of the Bristol underground scene, which involved collaborations between artists and musicians. Banksey has stated that he was personally inspired by 3D, a founding member of the musical group Massive Attack. His works are so popular that his public installations are usually resold, often by removing the entire section of wall that it was painted on. And yet, his identity is still a mystery. We do know that in 2003, he did an interview with Simon Hattenstone of The Guardian, and Simon described him as a white, 28-year-old scruffy-looking man with casual jeans, t-shirt, a silver tooth, silver chain, and silver earring. Banksey would claim he started his art at the age of 14. He also confirmed being expelled from school and serving time in prison for petty crime. He reportedly lived in Easton, Bristol in the 90s before moving to London around 2000. In 2008, a British newspaper would identify Banksey as a man named Robert Gunningham, and although unconfirmed, he is the most likely candidate. He was born just 12 miles from Bristol, and several of his schoolmates at Bristol Cathedral School have all confirmed he is Banksey. Researchers have also studied Robert's movements along the years and found that it matches up perfect with Banksy. And at some point, Robert Gunningham even changed his name to Robin Banks, which is how he got the nickname Banksy. However, some disagree and claim that the aforementioned 3D from the band Massive Attack, who was also a graffiti artist in the 80s, is Banksy. But maybe the strangest claim was that of a man named Billy Gannon, who was a local councilor for Pembroke Dock. In 2022, the speculation became so much of a hindrance that he had to resign from his duties as councilor. The fact that this man has written several books, along with doing several interviews, and still, no one knows his identity, is pretty amazing, especially these days. Big Muddy Monster. On June 25th, 1973, Randy Needham and Judy Johnson were parked on a boat dock near Big Muddy River in Murfreesboro, Illinois. The two were in search of some alone time, but something would ruin the mood because they both smelled something foul outside the car. Shortly after this, they would hear a loud scream, described as a, quote, eagle shrieking into a microphone, end quote, off into the wooded area. Randy would scan the area and heard another shriek. He would then turn on his headlights, and they spotted a 7-foot monster staring back at them. It was covered in white hair and mud, and looked sorta like a Bigfoot. Its eyes were glowing red, and it had yellow teeth. The two would flee the area, and actually go to the police. It should be noted here that Judy's father had forbidden Judy from dating Randy, which gives the story a bit of credibility, considering they took the case to the police, causing the story to spread like wildfire, and thus her father finding out. And to the police's credit, they actually went out to look around, and found large narrow footprints, about 3 to 4 inches deep in the mud, and 10 to 12 inches long and 3 inches wide. Law enforcement would also report that they heard a scream coming from the woods, which caused the men to flee back to the patrol car, but they didn't actually see the cryptid. The next day on June 26th, the creature was spotted again. This time, an officer on duty got a call that 2 teenagers were sitting on the back porch when they spotted a tall, white-haired, hairy creature in a field just off the edge of the woods. The police report read, quote, both Randy and Cheryl watched and observed a large creature walk out of the patch of trees near the edge of the yard, and then turn around and walk back into the field. The creature was described as being 7 to 8 feet tall, weighing 300 to 350 pounds, pale dirty white or cream colored, and standing on 2 feet. Creeth stated that he walked toward it and got approximately 30 to 40 feet from it. Creeth also stated that it had a musky odor to it, end quote. While the police were there, a neighbor would come over and say that his 5-year-old son had just spotted something near the edge of the woods 10 minutes prior. The boy claimed that he was out catching fireflies when he seen a huge white shape behind a fence in the yard, causing the young kid to run back inside. The officers would then go to search the area and stated that they smelled a noticeable stench and spotted a slimy film on the tree branches. The police department would take a dog to the scene, who tracked the scent all the way to a barn, but the dog refused to go in. The officers would then go in themselves, but they saw no sign of the creature. About 2 weeks later, a carnival owner living near the banks of the Big Muddy River would report to have seen the tall, hairy creature, which had been bothering the carnival ponies the day before. Many of the carnival workers would confirm that the ponies had been trying to break loose from the trees that they had been tethered to, and allegedly, the cryptid was seen observing the ponies from a nearby hut, though not in an aggressive manner. A few months after that, a local trucker sighted the creature a few miles outside of town, near the Mississippi River. Tracks were left behind and preserved. Allegedly, this was the last sighting, although I was able to find at least one more report from the late 80s. There are also other accounts that state this thing was spotted as far back as the 50s, but again, most people disregard these and all agree that the ones in 1973 are the only legit sightings. It's thought that this was a Bigfoot that was just traveling through the area, which explains why these few sightings are the only ones that ever happened, and why it was last seen at the Mississippi. So what was this thing? The police have stated that they believe the people really seen something. They also stated that the dogs really picked up a scent, leaving many to believe that this was the real deal. Body in the cylinder. In the summer of 1943, an American soldier was helping to clear the site at the back of a Methodist church in Liverpool, England, which had just been recently bombed by the Germans. An American bulldozer would uncover a cylinder while clearing building debris. It was 6'9" and had a diameter of 19 inches. One end of the cylinder was capped with a steel plate which bolted into place. The other end was open, but had been compressed and almost crimped shut by the bulldozer, which accidentally crushed it while moving it. It appeared to be a ventilation shaft from a ship. It would be pushed out of the way and left to the side for a couple of years. The cylinder would then basically blend into the background, only being used sometimes as a seat, and was often played with by children who liked to roll it around. Fast forward 2 years to July 13th, 1945. 3 small boys were playing with the cylinder. As they rode it along in the streets, one of the boys attempted to see what was inside, when they noticed what they thought was a shoe. Upon closer inspection, they realized it was a skeleton. The boys would go get an adult, who called the police. The authorities would then open the cylinder with an oxyacetylene torch and found a complete skeleton with a number of items. The remains were of a male around 6 foot tall and aged 25 to 50. The skull was broken near the middle left ear, but it didn't appear to be from violence. They at first thought that the man had crawled up into the cylinder during the German bombing, but that was ruled out after they discovered the skeleton was pretty old. However, he did crawl in it for some reason, because there was also a brick found wrapped in sacking that he was using as a pillow. He had also put something down to lay on, and the age of the skeleton, well, his clothing was traced back to the Victorian period, and they were good quality clothing. Found on the body was 2 diaries, 7 heavily rusted keys, and miscellaneous papers. The diaries were largely unreadable, but one clearly read, quote, "Appointments for 1 p.m. with F.C. Greedy at Cons," end quote. A postcard dated July 3rd, 1885, a handkerchief, a brooch, a gold ring that had the hallmark of London 1859, a London Northwestern Railway note dated to June 27, 1885, 5 account sheets, and 1 receipt. So who was this man? And how did he end up in this cylinder? And how long was he there? The coroner would state that due to insufficient evidence, it was impossible to reach a cause of death, but they believe he had died in the year 1885, and as far as his identity, the best guess they had was a man named Thomas Williams, who was a paint and brush manufacturer. He was declared bankrupt on March 10, 1884, and it's believed that he left his home due to his financial difficulties and was sleeping in the cylinder at what is assumed to be his business premises. Somehow, the cylinder was sealed with him in it, causing him to smother, most likely because of the way he had laid in it, had blocked the airflow. It's thought that at the time, his disappearance was intentional, and that most people likely believed he had fled his creditors and went to another country, hiding aboard a ship. And finally, more proof that it was probably Williams, is that his burial was never found, as the spot next to his wife was never used, nor is there a record of him ever dying. But some think Williams used the skeleton to fake his own death to escape creditors. Brianna Maitland. On Friday morning of March 19, 2004, 17-year-old Brianna Maitland would sit down to take an exam in order to receive her GED. After passing the test, she would go and have lunch with her mother to celebrate the occasion. Brianna would then discuss her future plans with her mom about attending college. They would then go shopping and run some errands. As they were waiting in the checkout line, her mother Kelly would later state that something caught Brianna's attention. She would tell her mother she would return shortly and walked out of the store. Kelly would catch up to Brianna in the parking lot and noted her demeanor had changed. She seemed rattled and agitated. She then told her mom she had to go home to get ready for work at her shift at the Black Lantern Inn in Montgomery, Vermont. Kelly did not want to pry, so she did not ask what had happened and just dropped her daughter off at her friend's home between 3:30 and 4. And that's something else to note here. Brianna had left home on her 17th birthday. Although there were no issues with her family or her home, she just wanted more independence and wanted to be closer to her friends that lived 15 miles away and went to a different school. But these living arrangements were unstable, and she moved in and out of several friends' homes. And by February 2004, she had quit high school and moved in with childhood friend Jillian Stout. This was now where her mother was dropping her off at. That evening, Brianna would leave a note for Jillian, which stated that she was headed to work and would be back later that night. After completing her shift around 11:20 p.m., she told her co-workers she needed to go home to rest because she worked the next day at her second job, and it was verified by everyone there that she left alone in her vehicle. Early the next afternoon, a Vermont state trooper was dispatched to an abandoned house about a mile from the Black Lantern Inn. It was here that Maitland's vehicle was found backed into the side of the house. The car's rear end had actually breached the home, and a piece of plywood used to cover the window now lay on the car's trunk. Inside lie 2 of Maitland's paychecks. On the outside, circled around the car, was a water bottle, unsmoked cigarette, and loose change. The trooper thought it was most likely abandoned by a drunk driver and called a tow truck. Brianna was not reported missing, however, and wouldn't be for a few days. Her mother, Kelly, did not even learn about the car until 5 days later, because Brianna's roommate Jillian had spent the weekend away, and when she came back Monday, she found the note Brianna had left and assumed that she ended up staying with someone else. It wasn't until the following day, when Brianna still had not appeared, that Jillian called her mother. Her mother, in turn, began calling all Brianna's friends, as well as her employers, none of whom had heard from her. They would go file a missing persons report. That's when the state troopers brought out the picture of the vehicle that had crashed into the home. Brianna's parents immediately identified it as belonging to her, and as far as the vehicle went, once the investigation began, they found at least 4 different witnesses that had seen the car at the abandoned house that night. One of them reported that the headlights were on. Another one mentioned that the turn signal was on, but none of the 4 seen a person there. Law enforcement would eventually conclude the foul play was involved and that the accident was staged. Law enforcement would get 2 early leads. One was that Brianna had been killed by 2 drug dealers that she was acquainted with. Police would actually do a raid on this home, but found no sign of Brianna. The second lead was one of Brianna's former friends had recently been arrested for assaulting her. She had actually broken Brianna's nose and gave her a concussion. She was set to go to trial soon, but charges were dropped after Brianna vanished. Detectives did investigate and clear her though. In 2022, Vermont State Police said they found a DNA match for an item found in or around Brianna's car, and that it matched one of 11 persons that they had tested previously. His identity has not been revealed yet, but maybe 2023 will be the year. Chase vaults moving coffins. In Oistins, Christchurch, Barbados, a burial vault lies in the cemetery of Christchurch Parish Church. This vault, the Chase family vault, is best known due to its moving coffins. The first published account of this story appeared in 1833 in General James Alexander's Transatlantic Sketches. He claimed that a woman named Mrs. Goddard was buried in the vault in 1807, followed by a 2-year-old Anne Marie Chase in 1808, and her older sister, 12-year-old Dorcas Chase, who was buried in 1812. The heavily sealed marble vault would then be opened again in late 1812 to place their father Thomas Chase inside. But here's when people realized the Chase sisters' caskets were found to be, quote, in a confused state, having been apparently tossed from their places, end quote. Alexander would follow up by stating that the vault was opened again later, quote, to receive the body of another infant. The 4 coffins, all of lead, all very heavy, were much disturbed, end quote. The infant, Samuel Brewster Ames's coffin, was said to be leaning head down against the wall. The vault would be found disturbed again in 1816 and 1819. After this, officials took notice and inspected it to make sure there was no secret passage or any other way to access the vault. They also raked sand into it in hopes of catching any footprints made. And when they checked again in 1820, no sand was disturbed. But again, all the coffins had been scattered and tumbled atop one another. The governor would then order them removed and buried separately, and then the vault was left open and unsealed. Researchers have tried to trace down the origin of this story, and it seems to go back to the head of the church during the early 1800s, that of Thomas Orderson. He would give conflicting accounts of the tale, always telling it differently. It was eventually picked up by Alexander 20 years later. The governor also allegedly recorded the account in his own book, Memoirs and Letters of Lord Combermere. Sadly, this book has been lost to time, but there's some conflicting accounts with the governor, as some sources state that he never actually witnessed this. He only heard about it, and then ordered the coffins removed. Regardless, as far as the validity of this story, no one can seem to find anything to substantiate the account. Even after combing through the newspaper archives from the time and the burial register at the church, nothing pops up, so it's most likely a hoax, as there's been several moving coffin legends over time. There's even one at Oak Island, but if the account was true, it's mostly been blamed on natural explanations, such as an earthquake. But that one's been pretty much ruled out, since there were no recorded earthquakes in Barbados in those years. Plus, Barbados is not seismically active anyways. The second option is water. It's possible that the vault flooded, but just how buoyant are those lead-lined coffins. Christopher Case. This is a creepy one. In 1991, a 35-year-old, Christopher Case, would leave his home in Seattle to go to a work conference being held in San Francisco. Chris had moved to Seattle from Raleigh, North Carolina, where he had previously worked as a radio broadcaster. I can only assume that this work conference was broadcaster related since there was no official record. But on his trip, Chris would meet a woman that he seemed to get along with really well. They both seemed to love the same music and spent hours together talking. Things were going well, but the woman would begin to make sexual advances towards Chris, and Chris was not interested and politely declined. This enraged the unnamed woman, who would end up telling him that she was a witch and that she was going to put a curse on him and that he would be dead within a week. This curse, well, it freaked Chris out. He would call his friends and vent and ask them for an opinion on what to do. He even called his friend, who was allegedly a psychic. This friend would later tell investigators that he was a stable person and did not believe in witchcraft or the occult prior to this incident. He would then tell her he was afraid and that the witch had been attacking him all night and cutting him. He said he had woke up with little cuts on the ends of his fingers. And now that I've mentioned investigator, you probably know where this one is going. On April 13th, one of Chris's friends will call the authorities in Seattle to ask for a wellness check to be done on their friend, as she had not been able to get a hold of him and feared for his safety. And for context here, I'm not sure if this is the same friend that was the psychic or not, but I think it was. Anyways, she ended up telling the police about the whole story with the witch and the curse and how Chris was getting paranoid and terrified. The police would be dispatched to the apartment. They would knock and no one answered, so they left. This actually happened a couple of times, but the last time they came, the door was now unlocked. It was actually discovered later on that Chris was too scared to stay in his apartment, so he spent the night at a hotel, which is why the officers missed him. But now they were in and found a very confusing scene. There were lines of salt all along the base of each wall in the apartment, as well as on the porch. The salt was believed to ward off evil forces, as well as several crucifixes and a dozen burned down candles spread throughout the residence. Making their way to the bathroom, they would find Christopher deceased in the bathtub. His cause of death would eventually be ruled as a heart attack, and because of that, it's largely been told that he scared himself to death. There's really only two theories in this mystery. Either the curse was real, or it wasn't. And if it was real, how did she do it? Secondly, who was she? Or did the curse become a self-fulfilling prophecy? It was obvious that Chris pulled out all the stops to deter the curse. Did he stress himself to the point of a heart attack? Dick Hansen. On April 29, 1991, former college football player Dick Hansen of San Jose, California, would go out to a bar with friends for some drinks. At 1 a.m., he and his date Jean left in her car, and by 1:30, they arrived at the restaurant where Hansen had left his pickup. While they were sitting there, a car pulled in behind them, and at first, it seemed like the driver was just trying to get to a mailbox, but he didn't get out. Jean asked if she should pull up, and Dick thought the man had plenty of room, so they would continue to talk. While they were talking, the man behind them just sat there. When they got ready to leave, Jean asked to follow Hansen back out because she was not familiar with the area. The two would then pull out in their separate vehicles, and so did the mysterious man. When they hit a traffic light and turned left, so did the man. Jean would even change lanes at one point, but the man jumped over too, staying right behind her. At the next light, Hansen signaled to Jean to follow him onto the freeway. When they did this, the man again followed them, this time for over 10 miles. Jean would try to change lanes a number of times in an effort to lose him, but it did not work. She even slammed on her brakes, but the man did the same thing. Jean was now pretty nervous by this point, and she would pull up next to Dick and ask him to pull into the police department. At this point, I have to clarify, I'm not sure if she did this at a stop or was just motioning to him as they were driving along the highway. Regardless, Hansen could not hear or understand her and just told her to follow him to the next exit. And again, the man followed them. When they both pulled over, Jean would point the man out to Hansen. He would get out of his pickup and walk back to confront him. Jean said that Hansen asked him what he wanted, and that the man replied, but she couldn't make out what he said. But she did see that he pointed towards her car, which I assumed she was sitting in. Whatever was said sent Hansen off, and he stepped back and became angry and started to swear at the driver. The man would then pull out a gun and shoot Hansen twice. Jean, who must have been acting on adrenaline alone, rushed to Hansen, who was now on the ground, but she came back to her senses in frozen fear as this strange man stared at her for a few seconds, before calmly pulling off into the night. A few moments later, another driver would pull over and called an ambulance for Hansen, but it was too late. He died at the scene. Although Jean was ruled out pretty quickly, investigators were stumped. They couldn't find a suspect or a motive. Jean did get a good description of the man. She said he had the stature of a football player and was white with a dark complexion, maybe Hispanic or maybe Mediterranean. He was in his late 30s or early 40s. He wore glasses with large black frames. His car looked like a 1970 Pontiac GTO and was a faded light gray or blue in color. She, along with the detectives, would also note her license plate, which said 49R space Hugs, a reference to the San Francisco 49ers, could have caused a mentally unbalanced fan of a rival team to follow her, absurd as that sounds. And going with the football angle, there was another possibility. Hansen looked a lot like an offensive lineman for the 49ers at that time, whose name was Harris Barton. Jean would even state that when they had dinner that night, two separate people asked him if he was Barton. If we go along with the crazy fan theory, it could make sense. But one key thing going against it, why was the man following Jean and not Hansen? All throughout the following of them, it was her whose car he had followed, weaving in and out of traffic. It was her car that he had pointed at. Hansen seemed more like he was in the way than anything else. Hansen's father, for his part, would be interviewed by a local paper and said that he was told that his son had been scolded by the man for blocking the mailbox, and due to road rage, followed the couple for over 10 miles only to kill him. The problem with this again, though, is why follow Jean? And who checks the mail at 1:30 in the morning? The man was never captured, or even identified. He would be in his 60s or his early 70s by now. Dyatlov Pass Incident. This is another one that I'm kinda surprised to find this deep into the iceberg, as I assume everyone has heard of this one. So for that reason, I'm just gonna kinda gloss over it. This is an event in which 9 Soviet hikers died in the northern Ural Mountains between February 1st and 2nd, 1959, under very mysterious circumstances. The group was led by Igor Dyatlov, and when the party did not return by the 12th, as they had intended, the relatives demanded a rescue operation. Searchers would go out to find the badly damaged tent on February 26th, and it was covered by snow. The whole thing baffled the searchers. Outside of the tent were 9 sets of footprints left by people wearing socks, one shoe, or even barefoot. They would also find the remains of a small fire near a pine. The first 2 bodies had only underwear, and it appeared that one of the skiers had climbed up into a tree to look for something. Between the campsite and tree line were 3 more corpses, whose body poses indicated that they were attempting to return to the tent. The 3 that were dressed warmer than the others indicated that they had taken clothes off of the dead ones. After the bodies were discovered, an investigation was launched, and it was determined that 6 of the hikers had died from hypothermia, while the other 3 had died from physical trauma. One had skull damage and chest trauma, another had a small crack in the skull. 4 of the victims lie next to a creek. 3 of those 4 had damaged soft tissues of the head and face, while 2 of them were missing eyes and 1 was missing a tongue. And strangely, 1 was missing eyebrows. The fatal injuries to 3 of the bodies were determined to have not been made by humans because the force of the blow had been too strong, and there were some levels of radiation found on at least one of the victims' clothing. This led to a theory later on that the Soviets were testing a secret weapon in the area, and this is what caused their deaths. But to this day, the avalanche theory is most agreed on, as that would account for why they fled so poorly clothed, and then after the avalanche passed, tried to make it back to get their clothes, only to freeze to death on the way. And all of the damage to the bodies was just caused by animals scavenging the corpses. However, skeptics point out that there was no sign of an avalanche, as well as the bodies would have been swept away. Another theory is a katabatic wind, which is just a strong wind that rushes down elevated slopes at hurricane speeds. They are rare and can be extremely violent. It would have made it impossible to stay in the tent, forcing them to abandon and hide in an improvised shelter, which collapsed from the wind, causing the injuries to some of the hikers. After these and the military theory, you get the lesser believed ones, like they were attacked by a local tribe of Banksey people, which is doubtful since there was no tracks left, or an animal attack, but again, there were no tracks, or there's another one that high winds blew one person away and the others attempted a failed rescue, but that doesn't explain why the tent didn't fly away. And oh yeah, how could I forget? It could have been a Yeti. Evilstick. In October 2014, just a week after Halloween, Nicole Allen of Dayton, Ohio, would buy her 2-year-old a toy that was a princess wand topped with flower petals. The cardboard package featured a smiling female with a disclaimer that said ages 3 and up. The package also stated, "The toy can send out wonderful music." Nicole thought it was nothing but a cheap toy and threw it into her cart. After she got home and gave it to her little one, she discovered instead of playing beautiful music when a button was pushed, it instead played a maniacal laugh. When Nicole looked closer, she also noticed that when the flower lit up, a piece of foil that was made transparent revealed a horrifying image of a woman with pupilless eyes pretending to slit her wrist. This was pretty alarming for a small child's toy. It's then that she noticed the toy's name, which was called Evilstick. Allen would actually tell her local news, and the story went viral. The CBS affiliate in Dayton would go to talk to the dollar store owner, Amar Mustafa, who had purchased the Evilsticks in 2012. He claimed that he had bought them at a retailer's convention and could not remember who sold them to him. A freelance journalist, Matt Clark, watching the coverage, didn't buy Mustafa's explanation and decided to investigate it for himself. He would go to the same exact store and look through the Evilsticks. It's then that he realized that the vast majority of them did not have that picture of the suicidal woman. Most of them were just anime pictures, although he did find one with a zombie. After searching for several minutes, he would finally come across the picture of the woman pretending to slit her wrist. He would upload a video of the toy to YouTube, and it quickly garnered lots of views. In the comment section, Clark and his viewers began trying to figure out where the toy had came from. They very quickly found the source of the picture, which was taken by a man named Butcher Ludwig. He had posted it to his website years ago, and had not given the toy maker permission to use it. Clark would end up using the barcode to find a lead, and it worked, as they found that it had came from a factory in China. He would contact a wholesaler through Alibaba, and told his subscribers that he would make a video as soon as he heard back. But Clark never posted again. This would lead to a theory that the Evilstick was actually cursed, and had harmed Clark in some way. But Clark would eventually be tracked down, and he confirmed that he never posted another video because the trail went cold. He said the factory that he had been talking to just stopped responding. So now it appeared that this wasn't just a knockoff item, instead a deliberate act of product tampering. Considering that a parent wouldn't even see the dark image until they got home and removed a tab, which allowed the toy to function, it seemed intentional. But who would go through all the trouble to do that, and why? Was it all done in the hopes of terrorizing a few children, or just a way to create an urban legend? Female stranger. At St. Paul's Cemetery in Alexandria, Virginia, lies an odd grave that has become something of a local landmark and an attraction in the area. On this gravestone is the name Female Stranger, who died in her husband's arms on October 14, 1816, at the age of 23 years old. The mysterious headstone would capture national attention in 1836, 20 years after her death, when newspaper columnist Susan Morgan would record the telling of the story in the Philadelphia Saturday Courier. She claimed that the stranger was a young foreign woman with a tearful face and pale complexion. She seemed to be ill and troubled. The stranger's male companion, also unnamed, was not believed to be her husband, at least not to the locals, and as soon as the female stranger was buried, the mysterious man quickly left town. But this is just one version of this tale, because this story, which becomes so romanticized over the next century, would have layer upon layer added to the story. But the basic gist is this. A young couple would arrive in Alexandria, Virginia, by ship in 1816, and rented the best room in Gadsby's Tavern. The woman was very beautiful, and one writer even described her as being blonde and voluptuous, but gravely ill. The man, who was also a handsome man, forbid anyone to see her face, making her wear a black veil in some accounts. But in every account, he swears the doctor and nurses to secrecy, and he never reveals their names. The woman will quickly deteriorate, and died on October 14, 1816, while still embraced in a kiss with her husband. The man would borrow money from a local businessman to bury her with, and then paid the man back with a note from the Bank of England. The stone would read, quote, "To the memory of a female stranger, whose mortal sufferings terminated on the 14th day of October 1816, aged 23 years and 8 months. This stone was placed by her disconsolate husband, in whose arms she sighed out her latest breath, and who, under God, did his utmost even to soothe the cold dead ear of death." End quote. He would then immediately leave town. And the note he paid with turned out to be a forgery. The man was then supposedly spotted a short time later in New Orleans, and in some tellings of the story, it's claimed that he came back for years putting flowers on her grave. Now, after going over all that, just who was this woman? One guess was Theodosia Burr Austin, who was the daughter of Aaron Burr, the third vice president. She was on a ship that was lost at sea, but this theory claims the ship was taken over by pirates and that she ended up marrying one of them, hence the secrecy involved. Yet, the dates don't really line up on this one. Another theory cites that it's a couple of star-crossed lovers who married against their parents' wishes, and the man did not want it to be divulged. And another theory states that it was possible that the two were actually wanted con artists. But going back to the star-crossed lover theory, nearly 70 years after the death, 2 elderly people would visit the grave. When the church superintendent questioned them, they claimed the woman was a connection of theirs, and that it was an English noblewoman who ran away with a British officer for love. Flatwoods Monster. On September 12, 1952, at 7:15 p.m., 2 brothers, Edward and Fred May, along with their friend Tommy Hire, would see a bright object cross the sky and land on the property of a local farmer, that of G. Bailey Fisher. The boys would go home to tell their mother. She would go along with the 3, and on the way, 2 more children would join, and a lone West Virginia National Guardsman, Eugene Lemon, and they would go to the farm to try and find what the boys had seen. As they got closer, one of the local dogs ran out ahead of them and started barking, and moments later, ran back to the group with its tail between its legs. The group would venture closer though, and when they got to the top of the hill, they saw a pulsing ball of fire. They also saw and smelled a mist that made their eyes and nose burn. Lemon would take out his flashlight and begin to look around, and caught the glimpse of a terrifying creature. It was said to be about 10 feet tall and 4 feet wide. It appeared to be wearing some sort of robotic suit, and it had a cloak in the shape of an ace of spades, behind a red round head. Set in the head were 2 eyes, described as portholes, glowing greenish orange. The body was metallic armored structure, lined with vertical pipes. Some say the armor was green, others say black, and most of the accounts state that it was armless or that it had toy-like arms. The cryptid would begin to make a hissing sound and started to glide towards the group. This caused Lemon to scream and drop his flashlight, and the panicked group ran. They would go to the sheriff's department and tell of the encounter, while also explaining the pungent smell that had made the entire group sick. Some had suffered throat irritation, vomiting, and nausea, which lasted for days. The sheriff and deputy before this had already received several calls over an alleged crashed aircraft in the area, so it wasn't just the boys that had seen it. But when the sheriff and deputy made it to the site, they found no crash and they smelled nothing. The following day, a local newspaper would send someone out to look at the scene. The man would find 2 tracks as well as traces of thick black liquid in the mud. UFO enthusiasts would later use this to claim that a craft had landed there. The story spread and it was covered by papers all across the country. It actually ended up being one of the top stories of that year. The case would be looked at again in 2000 by a group of skeptics who stated that the boys, along with some of the rest of the town, had seen a meteor, and that when they went to investigate, the ball of fire they seen was just an aircraft navigation or hazard beacon, and that the creature was nothing more than an owl. And even though that sounds pretty lame, this is what other skeptics, along with the Air Force, believes to be the case. The tracks and oily deposit left at the scene was also thought to have came from a local young man who had driven around at the scene looking for the crash site. But something overlooked in this. A day later, near a place ironically called Strange Creek, about 20 miles south of Flatwoods. Edith and George Snatowski, along with their 18-month-old son, would have a similar encounter after their vehicle died in a rural area. The road was deserted, and they reported smelling a sulfurous scent in the air, and the baby had begun to cry. They would then see a 10-foot-tall creature hover above the car, one that looked similar to the Flatwoods Monster, except for one thing. It was missing the spade-shaped hood. Instead, it had no hood, and the creature was reptilian and bony. Supposedly, it dragged its hand across the hood of the car before drifting off into the woods, and then the car started back up. Frederick Valentich. One of the more famous cases down at this layer is that of the Australian pilot, Frederick Valentich. During his 125 nautical mile training flight in a Cessna 182L light aircraft, he would vanish over the Bass Strait. And while that in itself is not super mysterious, the details around it are. At 7:06 p.m. on October 21st, 1978, Frederick would radio Melbourne Flight Service to report that an unidentified aircraft was following him at 4,500 feet. Traffic control would report back that there was no known aircrafts at that level. Frederick would then respond that he could see the large unknown aircraft, which appeared to be illuminated by 4 bright landing lights, and he was unable to confirm what type of aircraft, but he did say that it passed about 1,000 feet overhead, moving at a high rate of speed. He followed up by saying that the aircraft then was approaching him from the east. At first, he thought it was just another pilot who was screwing around with him, but he would end up reporting back that this aircraft was now orbiting above him, and that it had a shiny metal surface with a green light on it. It was at this time that his own aircraft began to experience engine problems. The air tower would ask Frederick, once again, to identify the aircraft, and Frederick would eerily say, quote, "It's not an aircraft," end quote. The transmission was then interrupted by unidentified noises described as, quote, "metallic scraping sounds," end quote, and then all contact was lost. A search would begin almost immediately, and in spite of searching over 1,000 square miles, no trace was found. The only possible wreckage found came 5 years later, when an engine cowl flap was found washed ashore on Flinders Island. The part was traced to a Cessna 182, which Frederick was flying, and the serial number fell within a certain range of numbers that Valentich's aircraft belonged to, yet they couldn't be certain. This case, of course, has brought the interest from many ufologists for obvious reasons, but what do the skeptics think? One of the main early theories was that Frederick planned the whole thing. For one, the aircraft never showed up on radar, casting doubts as to whether he was ever near Cape Otway, which he claimed, as well as the Melbourne police received several reports of a light aircraft making a mysterious landing not far from Cape Otway around the same exact time that the news had came out that he vanished, and he was said to be a UFO enthusiast. So it's possible that he wanted to leave this mystery as proof for UFOs. Another explanation is that he had become disoriented and was flying upside down, meaning the lights he saw were just his lights reflecting off the water. Yet, one thing against this is that model Cessna could not fly upside down for very long at all, and he would have crashed way sooner. This is also backed up by the fact that Frederick was a very inexperienced pilot who had twice failed all 5 commercial license examination subjects. But a new theory came out in 2013, as retired pilot James Magaha and author Joe Nickell believed that Valentich was deceived by the illusion of a tilted horizon, and he attempted to compensate for it and accidentally put his aircraft into a downward spiral called a graveyard spiral, all the way down till he hit the water. This would have caused a decrease in fuel flow, resulting in the rough idling that Frederick reported. Finally, as mentioned, a lot of ufologists point to this case as one of the key pieces of evidence for extraterrestrials, and claim that the aircraft was intentionally destroyed by a UFO, and or Frederick may have been abducted. Ghost rockets, also known as a Scandinavian ghost rocket, were rockets or missile-shaped UFOs that were spotted in 1946, mainly in Sweden, but also some in Finland. There were about 2,000 sightings logged between May and December of 1946, but the first official sighting was on February 26th. At least 200 of these rockets were verified by radar, and some physical fragments were found that are believed to have came from ghost rockets. For the majority of sightings, they were fast-flying rocket or missile-shaped objects with or without wings and only appeared for a few seconds, and in a few cases, a hissing or rumbling sound was reported with the sighting. Sometimes the reports would state that the item crashed into a body of water, and sometimes coming back to the top and propelling itself across the water before sinking again. The Swedish military did several dives but found nothing other than the occasional crater. Sometimes they flew very high and other times as low as a treetop, while some were said to have exploded in the air. Lieutenant Leonard Neckman of Sweden's Defense Staff Air Base would actually take advantage of the fact that former aviation general Jimmy Doolittle and General David Sarnoff were currently in Sweden on business. He would go and talk to them and show them all of the data on the ghost rockets. Sarnoff was convinced they were not a myth but real missiles. Shortly after this, the director of the CIG, the predecessor to the CIA, wrote a top-secret memo to President Truman based on the information brought back by Doolittle and Sarnoff. He claimed that the missiles were fired from Peenemünde, which was the German town known for creating the first functional large-scale rocket, the V-2. Peenemünde was now under Russian control after World War II, and he speculated that the rockets were for test purposes and were self-destructing before going over Swedish territory. But at least one top-secret document that was declassified in 1997 from the United States Air Force Europe, dated November 4th, 1948, speculated that the ghost rockets, along with some other curious flying saucer sightings, could be, quote, previously unknown or unidentified technology, possibly outside the Earth, end quote. The document would end by saying, quote, we are inclined not to discredit entirely this somewhat spectacular theory, meantime, keeping an open mind on the subject, end quote. There were also a few other rocket sightings over different countries, most notably Greece, who actually launched an investigation into it, but allegedly, they called it off at the behest of the United States. To this day, no one is sure if the ghost rockets were legit missiles, meteors, or alien in origin. Giant shrimp in the laundry room. Perhaps the most enigmatic cryptid we have discussed so far, the giant shrimp in the laundry room can be traced back to an issue of Strange magazine from the 90s, which published a transcription of a phone call message left by a woman named Virginia Staples. According to the story, Virginia stated in 1948, when she lived in Bremerton, Washington, she was hanging clothes on a clothesline in the basement of her apartment. The basement was gigantically huge, and there were huge holes in the walls, and it was rumored there was a passage to the water. She would go on to say on this particular day, she began to get the feeling that she was being watched, so she would turn around. Inside one of the huge holes in the basement stood a creature that was about 5 feet tall and bright orange, with little thin spidery legs and antennae. The woman would begin to cry as she told the story. She stated that it came towards her, and that she fled back up to the apartment. She was so scared, she began to pack immediately. She ended up leaving and moving in with her cousin. She would get the idea while living there to go visit an aquarium in hopes of identifying what it was that she had seen. While there, she spotted a shrimp, and that was the only thing that looked like it. She would state that the creature gave her nightmares for years. However, there are some issues with this story. For one, records show that during the time frame this story took place, the alleged street that it took place on, Denny Street, was home to several houses, but no apartments. Secondly, the story was published in Strange magazine in a section called First Person, which included unverified accounts of strange encounters. Basically, Strange magazine had an answering machine set up on a phone line for anyone to call in and leave an account of their strange experience. So because of that, the most likely theory is this was all a hoax. However, if it's not, then it's a very rare cryptid. Grave robbing for morons. This is a classic media mystery, and it starts in an era that I like to call the pre-internet era. And yes, I know you can technically trace the beginnings of the internet back to the 60s, but I'm talking about before the internet was in every home, and more specifically, before social media. And in this time period, there were communities where you could find pirated media, just like now. But back then, these pirated videos were on physical media, such as DVDs, where you could find all kinds of crazy stuff in the underground DVD trade. One of these films was called Ensuring Your Place in Hell. The contents of the first video are lost, if it ever existed, but the second volume is known by many because it was ripped and uploaded online and has been watched by a ton of people. It was a compilation made up of 4 different home movies, each being stranger than the last. The fourth and final video of this weird collection was called Grave Robbing for Morons, and it's at the center of this mystery. The video starts off in what seems to be mid-sentence. The quality is also pretty rough, as it's been ripped and recorded from a variety of sources over the years, so it's kinda hard to make out the young man's surroundings, but he is the focal point of this video. He appears to be in his mid-teens to early 20s at the oldest. He looks Latino, and he has a New York accent. He wears a black leather jacket with a red shirt and blue jeans. He also has dark, unkempt hair pulled back into a ponytail, and his large ears particularly stick out. Another thing that stands out is the kid's obvious speech impediment, as he seems to stutter a lot, but he holds in his hands what appears to be a real human skull, and he's talking about the process of cleaning it up to sell on the black market. The video comes off like he is trying to appear really cool or really tough. Maybe he's trying to impress his friends, who are also in the room with him. The young man refers to himself as Anthony Cass before he stops himself to think that maybe he shouldn't divulge his last name. So we only have Anthony to go by. His friend behind the camera is known as Gino, who does spin it around on himself for just a split second, but the quality is so bad you can't make out any of his features. Anthony then gives the names of a couple of other associates that help him, but we never see or hear these people, so who knows if they're real. Finally, in the video, we can see a VHS copy of the film Evil Dead 2 sitting on a nearby table. That did not come out until 1987, so we know this film must have been recorded after that. And judging by the rest of the room, it seems that it was most likely recorded between then and the early 90s. The mystery here is, was this real? The main theory is the whole video is a hoax, made up by some teens, probably after they had a few drinks, and that they were just trying to have some fun. Secondly was Anthony himself, whose grave robbing advice leaves much to be desired. Like his method to preserve bones is comically wrong, just like his claim to knock out witnesses so they think they were dreaming. It's too funny to be taken seriously, and I can't forget to mention his tip to get drunk and laid before you rob a grave. As far as the theory that it is real, well, Anthony does mention selling the remains to local magic shops, and while that is probably BS, you can still buy skulls online today. And I know Anthony lived in the pre-net time, but my point is that there has always been an underground market for it. Secondly is the skull itself, which is almost certainly real. It even appears to have dental implants. But I'll leave it up to you all to decide the validity of this video. But to me, I think it's more mysterious that after all this time, no one has identified Anthony. Harris County Jane Doe. Between 1970 and 2005, Samuel Little, the most prolific serial killer in United States history, would kill up to 93 women, many of whom were involved in drugs or prostitution. And Little, unlike a lot of other serial killers, did not make up the numbers of victims or make false confessions to be the killer of other unsolved murders. His confessions are considered to be very credible by detectives, mainly because so many of them, 60, would end up being confirmed by investigators. And it's because of that we are led to this next mystery. Little confessed to killing a woman in Houston, Texas, between the years of 1976 or 1979, or possibly even as late as 1993. He said he got off the I-10 freeway, did some cruising, and spotted a prostitute and picked her up. She told him to drive to an unspecified location, and he did. He claimed that he did not have sex with her, but did strangle and dump her body off on the side of the road. The woman was African American and was between the ages of 25 to 28. This case is one of those mysteries on here that has very little info available. And that is all for part 10. Thanks for listening.